Welcome, dear listener. Settle in. Find a comfortable position, perhaps in bed, with the light turned low. Take a breath and let it go slowly. Tonight, we'll wander gently into the quiet and sometimes curious world of the Middle Ages. No phones, no street lamps, no clocks glowing on a bedside table. Imagine yourself in a time when the night sky was the greatest source of light after sunset. A time when people lived by the rhythm of the sun and the slow movements of the moon. A time when sleep was not the compressed block we know today, but something softer, something that stretched and shifted with the seasons. Our theme tonight is simple but endlessly fascinating. How people slept in the Middle Ages. We'll explore the homes they rested in, the beds they built, the habits that shaped their nights. We'll meet individuals whose lives reveal how important sleep was and how fragile it could be. We'll wander into mysteries, half-forgotten customs, and the contrast between the ordinary villager and the wealthy noble. So, let your mind drift back, centuries ago, to an age without electricity, an age where the night was darker, colder, and quieter. And let's begin. Imagine yourself stepping into a small medieval village at dusk. The sun has just fallen behind the horizon. The air is cool, damp, and carrying the faint smell of smoke from hearth fires being banked for the night. Chickens are quieting, a few dogs bark distantly, and the chatter of villagers begins to fade. For most people in this time, the medieval peasants, sleep began not with a set schedule, but with the natural darkening of the sky. Without artificial light, night came suddenly. Candles and oil lamps existed, yes, but they were costly and not to be wasted. For most families, once the sun was gone, so too was their activity. Step inside a cottage. It is one room, maybe two at most. The walls are rough, perhaps daubed with clay and straw. The air is thick with warmth near the fire, but cooler and sharper near the small, shuttered window. In one corner lies a straw-filled mattress. It is not neat and uniform like the beds of today, but lumpy, uneven, and faintly sweet, with the scent of dried grasses. Sometimes, families stuffed their bedding with leaves or wool, depending on what they could spare. Here, a family would sleep together, not out of preference, but out of necessity. Parents, children, and sometimes even servants or guests would share the same sleeping space. Privacy was rare. Warmth, however, was shared. On cold winter nights, this closeness meant survival. Blankets were precious. If you were poor, your cover might be a rough woolen cloth, scratchy against the skin, but dense enough to hold in warmth. In some regions, animal skins were layered over the family bed. Imagine the feeling of curling under a heavy fur-lined cover, hearing the faint crackle of the last embers in the hearth. The rhythm of medieval sleep was often what we now call segmented sleep. People didn't always sleep in one continuous stretch. Instead, they tended to fall asleep shortly after dusk, rest for a few hours, and then naturally wake again in the deep middle of the night. This waking period was quiet, unhurried. Families might stir the fire, whisper softly, pray, or even step outside briefly to check on animals. Some used this time for small, private moments of reflection or conversation. After an hour or two, sleep would return a second sleep, carrying them gently until dawn. This segmented rhythm matched the pace of a world that moved slowly. There were no alarm clocks. The rooster's crow, or the light filtering through a thin wooden shutter, marked the beginning of the new day. Now, imagine the soundscape of a medieval night. Beyond the cottage walls, there is near silence, broken only by the wind in the trees or the occasional call of an owl. Within the home, the breathing of family members, the sigh of the fire, and perhaps the shifting of straw beneath tired bodies. The absence of constant noise, no traffic, no humming machines, meant that sleep came more easily, though not always more comfortably. For peasants, sleep was tied directly to labor. Long days in the fields, bending, planting, or harvesting under the sun, left bodies aching. When they lay down at night, it was not for leisure, but for recovery. And yet, sleep was not guaranteed to be restful. The bedding could harbor fleas, lice, or mites. The smoke from the fire might irritate the lungs, and hunger could gnaw at the stomach, disturbing dreams. Still, there was a rhythm, a cycle that repeated with the seasons. In summer, when days were long, sleep might come later and rise earlier. In winter, darkness stretched, and nights felt almost endless. People surrendered to these natural shifts, their rest expanding and contracting with the light. Not all cottages were the same. Some had raised wooden frames for beds, lifting sleepers away from the damp earthen floor. Others relied only on a pile of straw spread directly on the ground. Wealthier peasants might have a proper bedstead, with wooden posts and ropes laced tightly to hold the mattress. Every few weeks, the straw inside would be replaced, shaken out, or refreshed with herbs such as lavender or mint to mask smells and ward off pests. The act of preparing for bed was simple. There were no pajamas as we know them today. Instead, people often slept in the same linen shift or undertunic that they wore during the day. To undress fully would have felt impractical, even improper, in a world where the cold was ever present and family members were always near. And yet, even in this simplicity, there was comfort. Imagine lying on straw scented faintly with herbs, pulling a heavy woolen blanket to your chin, hearing the murmur of your family drifting into quiet sleep. Life was not easy, but there was familiarity in the nightly routine, a rhythm as steady as the turning of the seasons. As you picture this small, dimly lit cottage, perhaps you can feel the way darkness pressed in on the medieval night. For those who lived then, the world outside the door was vast, unknown, and shadowed. Inside, clustered together, they found not luxury but enough warmth, enough rest to carry them into another day. Now that we have rested in the cottage of a medieval peasant, let us step carefully into a very different world. A world not of straw mattresses on the floor, but of stone cloisters and echoing halls. Here, sleep was not only about rest, it was about devotion, routine, and obedience. One of the clearest windows into medieval sleep comes from the life of Benedictine monks, men who gave their entire lives to prayer, labor, and study. Among them was Saint Benedict himself, who, in the 6th century, wrote a set of rules, the Rule of Saint Benedict, that guided the rhythm of monastic life for centuries afterward. Imagine him, a man in a simple woolen habit, walking slowly through a dim stone corridor. The walls are cool to the touch, carrying the smell of damp stone and candle smoke. His footsteps echo. Outside, the night is deep, but within the monastery, the bells mark time. The bell decides when the brothers pray, when they eat, and yes, when they sleep. According to the rule, monks were not meant to sleep excessively. Rest was necessary, but it was never to become indulgence. Benedict's instructions were careful, almost mathematical. 6 to 8 hours of rest in total, often divided into parts, with long interruptions for worship. Sleep was always subordinate to prayer. Picture a monk's cell. It is small, bare, and quiet. A narrow bed, perhaps with a thin straw mattress and a single woolen blanket. There is no pillow, unless the abbot allowed it. The clothing a monk wore to bed was often the same habit he wore during the day. Sleep was stripped of comfort, designed to keep the body rested, but never pampered. At night, the rhythm was broken by the call to vigils, also called mat. In the deep of the night, sometimes around midnight, sometimes a little later, the monks would be woken by the toll of a bell. Rising from their narrow beds, they would gather silently in the church, the air cold and still. Their voices would rise together in chant, psalms echoing softly against the stone arches. The sound was low, measured, and repetitive, almost like a lullaby carried into the darkness. After vigils, the monks might return briefly to their beds, slipping back into rest for a short while before dawn. Then, with the first light of day, they rose again, ready to chant the next office, Lord's. In this way, their nights were not solid blocks of slumber, but carefully segmented hours, each one woven into the larger pattern of prayer and duty. This strict cycle reveals how differently medieval people thought about sleep. Today, we value continuity, an uninterrupted night's rest. For monks, interruption was the point. Night was not for escape, but for watchfulness. The darkness belonged to God as much as the day did. Imagine the sensation, drifting into light sleep, only to hear the bell strike and the brethren rise. The air chilled, bare feet on stone floors, voices lifting into darkness. The body weary, but the spirit sharpened through discipline. Sleep then became not just physical recovery, but a spiritual exercise. Not all monasteries were identical. Some, especially in harsher climates, allowed more rest in winter. Others were stricter, limiting hours in bed to prevent sloth. Yet everywhere, the central idea was the same. Night belonged to more than just sleep. It belonged to worship, reflection, and the ever-turning wheel of devotion. Outside monasteries, there were noble households that echoed a similar rhythm. Kings and queens, knights and courtiers, also broke their nights into parts. Historical records describe rulers who took counsel in the midnight hours, who read letters, who prayed by candlelight before returning to bed. In a world without bright lamps or long evenings of entertainment, these nighttime interludes became moments of quiet work or private thought. Let us linger, though, with the monk. Imagine yourself standing in the cold cloister after matins, the stars faintly visible through an arched window. Your breath forms pale clouds in the air. The silence is vast, broken only by the slow shuffle of sandals on stone as the brethren return to their cells. You lie down once more on your straw mattress, the wool blanket rough against your skin, the memory of chanting still in your ears. Sleep comes again, lighter, softer, carrying you toward dawn. The story of Benedict and his rule is not only about monks, it shaped how medieval Europe, more broadly, thought about sleep. His words influenced households, noble courts, and even the rhythm of cities. The idea that sleep should be purposeful, structured, and in moderation filtered outward, reminding people that rest was part of a moral life, not merely a physical necessity. When you close your eyes and think of medieval sleep, it may help to remember these two contrasting images. The cottage family sharing warmth on their straw bed, and the monk rising in the midnight cold to chant softly in stone halls. Both existed at the same time. Both were shaped by the same dark nights, the same turning seasons, yet their purposes were different. For one, sleep was survival. For the other, it was sacrifice. And now, as we step out of the monastery and leave Saint Benedict and his followers behind, we turn toward the shadows of mystery and discovery. Because in the medieval world, sleep was not only shaped by necessity and devotion, it was also layered with belief, with superstition, and with meanings we are still uncovering today. Sleep in the Middle Ages was not only a practical matter of straw, wood, and wool. It was also deeply cultural, wrapped in layers of mystery, belief, and quiet superstition. For people living then, the night was not only a time for rest, but a realm of uncertainty, a space between worlds. Let us begin with what archaeologists have uncovered. When medieval homes collapse or rot into the soil, what is left behind can sometimes tell us about the spaces where people slept. Excavations of cottages reveal dark stains of long-gone wooden bed frames, impressions of straw-packed mattresses, and occasionally traces of herbs woven into bedding. Lavender, mint, and wormwood were common. Their presence meant more than fragrance. They were thought to protect sleepers from pests and, in some cases, from evil spirits that prowled at night. Imagine lying down on such a bed, the faint dry perfume of crushed lavender rising as you shift on the straw. The smell is calming, soothing, much as it is today. But for the medieval sleeper, it was also a shield, a barrier against both the natural discomforts of fleas and the unseen dangers of the spiritual world. Because in the medieval mind, night was a vulnerable time. Sleep was considered a kind of little death, a state where the soul wandered, exposed, perhaps even at risk. Dreams were not random flickers of the brain. They were messages, warnings, or glimpses into the divine. Medieval dream books, fragile manuscripts passed between monks, nobles, and the curious listed long catalogues of meanings. To dream of water could mean wealth or danger, depending on its clarity. To dream of animals was to be given signs of character or fate. Dreams of flight might be glimpses of angelic guidance, or whispers of temptation. Picture a candlelit chamber, a noble lady sitting with a scribe, carefully recounting the fragments of a dream. The scratching of the quill on parchment, the flicker of shadows on the wall, and the hushed tones of interpretation turning the night's visions into prophecy. In this way, sleep itself became an object of study, a mysterious frontier where heaven and earth seemed to meet. And it wasn't only dreams. There were widespread beliefs about what might happen if you were disturbed at night. A sudden knock at the door, a shadow across the window, the sound of footsteps outside, all might stir unease. In some rural villages, people believed in night visitors, wandering spirits, or even witches who could press down on the chest of a sleeper, stealing breath. Today, we would call this sleep paralysis. Then, it was the night hag, an unseen force pressing the body in darkness. Even the position of sleep held meaning. Medieval physicians, drawing on ancient Greek medical ideas, advised that one should begin sleeping on the right side to aid digestion before turning to the left later in the night. Too much lying on the back was frowned upon, associated with troubling dreams or dangerous vapors in the body. These medical ideas may sound strange now, but they shaped the choices people made before closing their eyes. From an archaeological perspective, we also see how status shaped sleep. In castles, great wooden bedsteads survive, their frames carved with intricate designs. Some had curtains not only for warmth, but for privacy. Imagine pulling thick woolen curtains around you at night, cocooning yourself against drafts, against insects, against curious eyes. The enclosed bed became its own little world, a chamber within a chamber. Peasants too sometimes built box beds, especially in colder regions. These were wooden enclosures, more like cupboards, with sliding doors or shutters. The sleeper would climb inside, sealing themselves into a snug, dark space. To us, it might feel claustrophobic. To them, it was warmth, safety, and security from the chill air that crept through cracks in the walls. In the cultural imagination, sleep was also linked to sin and virtue. Too much sleep, it was said, was sloth, one of the 7 deadly sins. Too little sleep could be praised as devotion, but it might also bring weakness. The balance was delicate. Preachers spoke often about the dangers of oversleeping, warning that idle hours in bed opened the door to temptation. And so, people measured their rest not only against their bodies, but against their souls. Think, too, of the way night shaped community. In some villages, night watchmen were employed to keep guard, calling out the hours as they passed. Their voices, drifting through the dark, reminded people that time was moving, that safety was being kept. If you woke in the middle of the night, as many did, you might hear the faint cry of the watch, 3 of the clock, and all is well. And then, perhaps, return more peacefully to your second sleep. Dreams, spirits, the watchman's call, the scent of herbs, all of these colored the medieval experience of sleep. Night was not empty silence. It was a time filled with unseen presence, with meaning and mystery. Even now, as we look back, we find ourselves wondering about those sleepers. What did they dream of on their straw beds? What did they fear as the wind creaked against wooden shutters? What comfort did they find, huddled close with family or enclosed in a curtained bed? The answers slip through time like shadows, but the traces remain in books of dreams, in the outlines of beds, in the whispered tales of night visitors and watchmen. The medieval night was not only a time of sleep, it was a world of its own, half illuminated by candlelight, half veiled in superstition, endlessly mysterious. And so, from these shadows of culture and belief, we now move toward contrast, because not everyone slept the same way. The medieval world was layered, divided by wealth and status. To see that fully, we must step into the chambers of the elite, into the great halls and noble bedrooms, where sleep looked very different indeed. So far, we have rested in the cottages of peasants, walked the stone cloisters of monks, and wandered through the shadows of belief and mystery. But to complete the picture, we must now step into the chambers of the medieval elite, where sleep itself became a symbol of wealth, comfort, and even power. Imagine a great hall inside a castle. The air is heavy with the smell of smoke from the hearth, with rushes strewn across the floor, sweetened by herbs to mask odors. At the far end of the hall stands a raised platform, a dais, upon which rests the Lord's bed. This was not merely a place for sleep, but a stage, a throne in fabric and wood. To lie here was to display status. Noble beds were immense, carved from oak or walnut, their posts towering and draped with cloth of rich colors, crimson, deep blue, or green. Curtains hung thickly, enclosing the sleeper not only in warmth, but in privacy. Unlike the peasants, who shared their space with family, neighbors, and even animals, the noble bed was personal, guarded, and elevated. Picture drawing those curtains closed, the faint rustle of linen, the heaviness of wool. Inside, the noble or monarch found a small, silent world, candles guttering low on a stand outside, servants settling quietly onto pallets at the edge of the chamber. The mattress was stuffed, not with straw, but with feathers. Smooth linen sheets lay beneath embroidered coverlets. Sleep here was softer, warmer, and more refined. And yet, it was never fully private. In many courts, sleep was semi-public. Servants attended their masters through the night. Ladies-in-waiting slept nearby. Guards kept watch. Even in slumber, a king or queen was not alone. To rest in luxury was also to rest under constant observation. Across regions, the habits varied. In France, nobles favored feather beds piled high, sometimes so elevated that a stool was required to climb in. In England, aristocrats cherished fine wool blankets, dyed and decorated. In Islamic Spain, where contact with the wider Mediterranean world was stronger, bedrooms were often more open, cooler, with cushions and rugs spread for reclining. Silk and cotton fabrics were traded, adding softness unknown in Northern Europe. For the wealthy, the rhythm of segmented sleep still applied, but it was shaped by their resources. The first sleep might be preceded by reading, or by quiet conversation with trusted companions. During the wakeful middle hours, nobles sometimes conducted business in hushed tones, discussed strategy, or entertained small groups. By candlelight or oil lamp, these midnight meetings unfolded in the stillness of night, when the rest of the household was quiet. The second sleep would then carry them to dawn. Contrast this with the peasant's bed, a straw-stuffed sack shared with children and perhaps even livestock nearby. For peasants, waking in the night meant stirring the fire, comforting a restless child, or simply lying awake in darkness. For nobles, it could mean a private audience, or the exchange of letters, or quiet prayer beneath heavy tapestries. There was also the matter of health. Medieval physicians advised nobles just as they did peasants, but with more attention. Manuals recommended sleeping with the head slightly raised, avoiding heavy meals before bed, and ensuring clean sheets. These instructions were easier for the rich to follow, and so their nights may have been more comfortable, though not free from the same dangers of illness, cold, or disturbance. Sleep, for the elite, also served symbolic purposes. A monarch's bed could be a place of ceremony. In France, the ritual of the coucher, the royal bedtime, was attended by courtiers, turning the act of lying down to sleep into a moment of public ritual. The very way a king went to bed became part of his authority. Meanwhile, in rural villages, bedtime was simple, private, and unceremonious. The family banked the fire, settled into the straw, and let the night close around them. No ritual, no audience, only the steady breathing of those gathered together against the dark. Across Europe, climate shaped sleep, too. In northern regions, nights were long and bitterly cold. Extra furs and enclosed box beds were prized. In the south, heat meant more open sleeping arrangements, sometimes even outdoors in summer, beneath the stars. In the Mediterranean, sleep spilled more naturally into day and night cycles, with midday rests balancing shorter nights. In all of these contrasts, the theme remains the same. Medieval sleep was practical, segmented, and shaped by necessity. But it also reflected identity. To be noble meant sleeping high above the hall, on feathers, enclosed by embroidered curtains. To be a peasant meant straw on the floor, warmth shared shoulder to shoulder. To be a monk meant rising in darkness to chant in stone halls. Each person's night reflected their place in the world. Now, as you picture these scenes, the grand bedstead of a noble chamber, the quiet cot of a monk, the crowded straw of a peasant's cottage, allow the differences to soften and blend, because across them all lay the same essential human rhythm: the need to close the eyes, the need to rest the body, the steady cycle of first sleep, wakefulness, and second sleep, echoing from peasant hut to castle tower. And so, as our journey through medieval nights comes to its close, we step into reflection. What does it mean, now, to sleep in comfort and safety, compared to then? What does it mean to carry these quiet traces of the past into our own modern nights? The Middle Ages, stretching roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, were characterized by their simplicity and their stark realities. Unlike today, when sleep is often considered a luxury or something we carefully plan around our busy lives, sleep in medieval times was dictated by the most fundamental forces: the sun, the weather, and survival. As you settle into the rhythm of the medieval world, picture yourself waking with the first light of dawn. The sun rises slowly over the horizon, casting a pale golden hue over the countryside or the cobbled streets of a bustling town. There is no electricity to rouse you from your sleep. Instead, you are awoken by the soft, natural light, or the sounds of the world around you. Perhaps the distant call of a rooster, or the stirring of animals in the barn, signals the start of your day. In the rural villages, where most of the population lived, the day began early. There were no clocks, no watches, only the passage of time, as measured by the sun's rise and set. People would work with the land from the first hint of light until dusk. The tasks were simple, but they were relentless. Planting, harvesting, tending animals' life was a constant cycle of physical labor. As evening fell, the pace of life slowed. The light dimmed, and people retreated into their homes, which were often small, dark spaces, Candles, if you could afford them, flickered softly against the walls, offering little warmth or light. The fire in the hearth, however, was the heart of the home. It provided warmth, light, and the means to cook food. But even with the hearth crackling, there was an undeniable chill in the air, especially during the long, harsh winters. Now, as darkness fell, sleep was almost inevitable. But it wasn't the kind of sleep we think of today. Many people in the Middle Ages practiced a form of sleep that might seem strange to us. They didn't simply sleep for a solid 8 hours through the night. Instead, they often followed a pattern known as segmented sleep, to distinct periods of rest with a waking period in between. Imagine yourself lying in your bed, perhaps a simple pallet of straw, tucked under heavy woolen blankets. The room is cold, and the crackle of the fire does little to stave off the chill. You drift off to sleep, perhaps around nightfall, when the darkness feels absolute. But this sleep isn't uninterrupted. After a few hours, perhaps at around midnight, you wake. The room is silent except for the occasional sound of the fire's embers shifting. During this wakeful period, many would rise to tend to practical matters, checking the fire, praying, or even socializing in some cases. This might be the time when the mind, free of the day's demands, would wander. People would often spend this time in quiet contemplation or, in the case of the wealthier, perhaps even reading or writing by candlelight. The waking period, sometimes lasting an hour or so, was a natural break in the flow of sleep. For many, it was a moment of stillness, a moment to reflect. And then, as the second sleep beckoned, people would return to their beds for a few more hours of rest. By the time dawn broke, the cycle would begin again. In towns and cities, where life was slightly different, people would still follow this rhythm. But here, there might be the added presence of more light sources, perhaps a candle or a lantern outside the window. The noise of the town might also be more persistent market noises, the chatter of people, the clatter of horses, hooves on cobblestones. Yet, despite the bustling surroundings, the rhythm of sleep remained largely the same. Natural light, the rise and fall of the day, and the steady cycle of rest. In these humble homes, sleep was not seen as a time for leisure or comfort, but as a necessary pause. Life was lived with a constant awareness of the elements and the dangers of the world. Diseases could spread rapidly, and the threat of banditry or conflict was ever present. Therefore, sleep, however fragmented, became a respite, a moment of peace in a world that seldom allowed for it. The homes of the poor, while humble, were often shared spaces, with several members of the family sleeping in one room. It was not uncommon for entire households to huddle together for warmth, seeking the comfort of shared bodies in a world where a bed was a rare luxury. In some homes, the notion of privacy was almost foreign, and the idea of having a personal sleeping space was a privilege enjoyed only by the very rich. Even in the grounder estates of the nobility, sleep was influenced by the same basic rhythms. The grand halls of castles, with their towering stone walls and high ceilings, were often cold, and the beds in these great rooms were filled with heavy linens and furs. The lords and ladies of the manor might retire to their chambers earlier than the common folk, but the same segmented sleep pattern prevailed. Their chambers were decorated with tapestries and carpets, providing a sense of comfort, but their sleep was just as much a necessity as it was for the peasant. Yet, despite the differences in living conditions, sleep in the Middle Ages shared a fundamental quality. It was not a luxury, but a necessity for survival. The rhythm of the day work during the light hours, rest during the dark hours, was driven by the natural world. And as the night deepened, people, whether noble or commoner, would surrender to sleep, finding peace in the quiet of the night before the cycle began anew. As we drift further into the world of medieval slumber, let us shift our gaze toward the lives of those whose names have echoed through history: kings, queens, monks, and scholars, individuals whose days were marked by weighty decisions, religious devotion, or endless duty. And yet, even these figures, with all their responsibilities and ambitions, had to contend with the same human need for rest. Imagine now the quiet solitude of a royal chamber, its stone walls draped in thick tapestries to blunt the cold, the faint scent of beeswax candles lingering in the air, and a bed far larger than most in the kingdom, layered with feather-stuffed mattresses, embroidered pillows, and fur-lined blankets. This is the sleeping chamber of King Henry II of England, a man whose reign was shaped by turbulent politics, family strife, and restless ambition. Yet even kings must sleep, though the weight of a kingdom pressed on his shoulders. Henry would have adhered to many of the same sleep customs as his subjects segmented sleep: early nights dictated by candlelight and fatigue, and waking hours in the dead of night. For a man constantly embroiled in disputes between his sons, with Thomas Becket, and with the church, these midnight hours may have provided a rare moment of peace, or perhaps of contemplation and strategic planning. Historical records suggest that Henry, like many monarchs, often held meetings and corresponded with advisors during odd hours. In a world lit only by fire and candle, the quiet wakefulness of night might have been his most productive time. The first sleep, then a few hours of thought or scribbling in the flickering candlelight, followed by a second sleep before the day's burdens returned. Consider also the sleep of Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess, visionary, and composer. Her life, cloistered within the stone walls of a Benedictine monastery, followed the structured rhythm of the rule of St. Benedict, a monastic code that dictated sleep, work, and prayer. Monks and nuns like Hildegard typically rose in the middle of the night for vigils, the midnight prayers that punctuated their spiritual routines. The monastic night was not silent. Bells marked the passage of time, and the call to prayer could come as early as 2 or 3 in the morning. Sleep was limited, intentionally so. In the monastic tradition, too much sleep was seen as slothful, a temptation of the flesh. It was not uncommon for monks and nuns to sleep on simple wooden boards, with little more than a rough blanket for warmth. In these communities, the rhythm of sleep was shaped by devotion rather than comfort. Picture the abbess, rising from her modest bed in the pre-dawn hours, the air thick with the scent of cold stone and wax. She walks silently through the cloister, her footsteps echoing faintly, her breath forming pale clouds in the chill. In the chapel, others gather, cloaked and drowsy, their voices rising in quiet chant matins. The night office, offered to a world still asleep. For Hildegard, these midnight awakenings were not just discipline, they were windows into mystical insight, moments when her visions would sometimes come. Now imagine a different kind of medieval figure: Margery Kempe, a woman of the 14th century, remembered for her pilgrimages and spiritual autobiography. Margery's life was marked by spiritual fervor, emotional intensity, and frequent conflict with the expectations of her society. In her writings, we find glimpses of her sleep or lack thereof. During moments of spiritual ecstasy or divine visions, she often fasted and slept little, seeking closeness to the divine through physical deprivation. Her sleeplessness was not uncommon among the deeply devout. For those on pilgrimages or engaged in long nights of prayer, sleep was secondary to salvation. Margery's restless nights, spent praying or weeping or waiting for visions, speak to a different relationship with sleep, one shaped not by cycles of labor, but by emotional and spiritual intensity. And then, of course, there is the scholar. Let us turn briefly to Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century philosopher and theologian. His days were filled with thought, debate, and writing, but his nights by necessity held rest. While his exact sleep habits are not recorded in detail, the culture of medieval scholarship demanded early rising and often late nights. The flickering candlelight, the scratch of the quill, the scent of parchment and ink. In these hours, ideas flowed. But always, there came a point when thought gave way to fatigue, and the body sought refuge in sleep. For learned men of his time, sleep was seen not as an indulgence, but as a necessity for mental clarity. Yet, moderation was key. Too much rest dulled the intellect, too little bred distraction. Even in academic settings, sleep followed a moral rhythm, a balance of physical needs and spiritual discipline. Across all these lives, king and nun, pilgrim and philosopher, the need for rest was ever present. Whether in the vast, draughty chambers of a castle or the narrow cell of a monastery, the rhythm of sleep persisted. Even when disrupted by duty, devotion, or unrest, it remained a defining thread in the fabric of their existence. In the end, whether burdened by crowns or lifted by faith, these medieval figures moved through nights, shaped by the same quiet cycles. Sleep, with its strange patterns and quiet hours, held a place in even the busiest lives. And just as in yours, it was a moment of surrender, of stillness, of quiet restoration. Let the images of those medieval nights drift through your mind. The flickering candle in a scholar's study, the hush of a monastery cloaked in early morning mist, the cold stone walls that held both kings and pilgrims in slumber. The night was long, and their sleep interrupted. Sacred, necessary tied them to the world, in the same way it ties us. Now, let us gently transition from the lives of notable individuals to something more mysterious, more textured, a glimpse into the archaeological and cultural remnants of sleep in the medieval world. As we continue our quiet exploration of medieval sleep, let us drift into a more mysterious realm, one built not from written chronicles or famous names, but from remnants buried beneath the soil, whispered through old customs and hinted at in forgotten texts. When we speak of sleep in the Middle Ages, we must also listen closely for what was never directly said. Sleep, being a private, nightly ritual, often escaped the historical record in favor of events considered more significant: battles, laws, births, deaths. And yet, in archaeology and folklore, we find the quiet echoes of how people rested. These traces tell us much not in loud declarations, but in soft clues left behind. Let us begin in a simple, unearthed home. Archaeologists excavating medieval settlements across Europe have uncovered the remains of dwellings once filled with live wooden beams long rotted away, hearthstones cracked and weathered, and in some places, depressions in the ground that hint at where beds once lay. In modest peasant homes, there were rarely dedicated bedrooms. The sleeping space was often a shared area, close to the fire, close to each other. Warmth was the ultimate luxury. Excavations in places like Warham Percy, an abandoned medieval village in Yorkshire, England, have revealed not just structures, but the subtle organization of space. The largest area was reserved for daily life: cooking, weaving, eating, and the sleeping space would have been nearby, perhaps on a raised platform or even a built-in bench against a wall. Families, sometimes with animals nearby, would huddle together. In these simple homes, beds were not always separate pieces of furniture, but arrangements of straw, hay, or rushes covered with cloth and furs. Over time, more prosperous households added wooden bed frames, rope supports, and even curtains to trap warmth. The evidence is faint but meaningful: a charred beam, a nail driven into a wall where a curtain once hung. These are the quiet artifacts of medieval rest, and though we do not have the beds themselves, we can see their imprint, physical and cultural, on the lives of the people who used them. Beyond the homes, the graves speak softly. In medieval cemeteries, the dead were most often buried in a supine position on their backs, hands folded over the chest or abdomen. This pose, strikingly similar to a person at rest, mirrored the medieval Christian view of death as a kind of sleep. The body, temporarily at peace, awaited resurrection. Death, then, was simply another slumber, one that would last until the end of days. Grave goods, common in earlier eras, were largely absent in Christian burials, but sometimes subtle clues remain. A burial discovered with fragments of woolen cloth wrapped around the head, a faint trace of downy feathers beneath the shoulders. These small comforts, preserved by chance, suggest the desire to ease the transition from one rest to the next. And in the monasteries, as we've touched on, sleep was regimented. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed across much of medieval Europe, offered precise instructions on when monks should sleep, rise, and pray. But not just when, how. Monks were discouraged from indulging in sleep. Many slept in their habits, on simple beds, sometimes even on the floor. The dormitories' long, echoing halls held rows of narrow beds or wooden platforms, quiet, dark, and cold. Fragments of monastic schedules still survive: hand-copied timetables, marginal notes in illuminated manuscripts. These texts outlined the hours of the divine office, matins, Lord's prime, and so on. Monks would rise in the night, sometimes for hours at a time, then return to bed only to rise again before dawn. Sleep was necessary, but it was also a battleground, an opportunity to overcome the temptations of comfort and embrace a higher discipline. Yet outside the cloisters, in the villages and towns, sleep was less strict, more shaped by the seasons and the culture of place. In Scandinavia, winter nights stretched long. People likely followed even more pronounced segmented sleep patterns, perhaps even 3 phases of sleep in the depths of winter. In warmer regions, like the Mediterranean, siestas were practiced in the heat of day, redistributing sleep in ways that mirrored ancient traditions. Sleep customs also appear in folklore and household traditions. In parts of medieval France and Germany, it was believed that sleep could make one vulnerable to spirits or night demons, like the Mara, a creature that would sit on the chest of the sleeper, causing nightmares or a sense of suffocation. The modern word nightmare comes from this very root. To ward off such spirits, charms were placed near the bed, a sprig of herbs, a carved piece of wood, or even a protective prayer pinned to the wall. Beds themselves became symbols of status and comfort. In inventories of noble estates, beds are described in exquisite detail. Oak frames carved with delicate designs, mattresses stuffed with goose down, linens imported from distant lands, and canopies suspended overhead. These were not merely for sleeping, they were symbols of wealth, privacy, and power. In a world where most people slept in shared spaces, the ability to sleep alone, on a bed with fine sheets, was an expression of status as much as comfort. And yet, even among the elite, sleep was vulnerable. Diaries and letters from the medieval gentry describe interrupted nights, fears of thieves or fire, and sleeplessness caused by illness or stress. Some even mention dreams as omens, as disturbances, or as revelations. Sleep, for all its routine, remained mysterious. Among the more curious cultural legacies are dream books, manuals used by monks and lay people alike to interpret dreams. Sleep was not just for rest, it was a space where the divine could speak. A dream of water might suggest a coming change. A dream of falling could signify pride, though not everyone had access to such books. The idea that sleep held hidden meanings was widespread. As we gently move through these quiet clues, archaeological remnants, grave markers, fragments of furniture, whispered folklore, we begin to see that medieval sleep was not simply a physical act. It was a cultural experience, woven with belief, shaped by environment, and shared across every stratum of society. From the humblest straw mattress to the grandest feather bed, the patterns of rest reveal how people lived, how they died, and how they understood the space between. Now, as the candles burn low and the night deepens, let your thoughts settle. The sounds of ancient villages, of footsteps echoing in stone monasteries, and of rustling straw bedding fade into silence. Next, we will turn our gaze to the contrasting world of the medieval elite, to social customs, privileges, and sleeping arrangements of those who ruled, and how their rest was as much a performance of power as a personal necessity. As we now enter the final chapter of our medieval journey through sleep, allow your mind to settle into the long halls of noble estates, the cloistered chambers of queens and courtiers, and the silken canopies of sleeping spaces, built not only for rest but for status, control, and image. Sleep, even in its most basic form, is a shared human necessity. But in the Middle Ages, as in every era, the way one slept, the where, the with whom, the how became a reflection of class, wealth, and identity. Let us begin in the bedchamber of a noblewoman. The room is still, the scent of lavender and rosewater clings to the air, infused into the linens and softly simmering in a bowl near the hearth. The walls are lined with heavy tapestries depicting hunting scenes, mythical creatures, or religious iconography, not only for decoration, but to insulate against the draft of stone walls. The bed stands elevated on a platform, its posts reaching high, draped in rich cloth. Embroidered pillows, furs, and finely spun linens complete the nest. This is a space not merely for sleep, it is a statement. In the upper tiers of medieval society, sleep was as much about privacy and prestige as it was about rest. Unlike the single-room homes of commoners, the elite had designated bedchambers, sometimes several used at different times of year or to accommodate different guests. The master bed, often massive in size and ornately carved, was a symbol of authority. The act of being invited into a lord or lady's chamber was an intimate gesture, reserved for family, trusted advisors, or distinguished guests, but these spaces were seldom entirely private. In royal courts, sleeping arrangements followed rigid hierarchies. Servants or ladies-in-waiting might sleep nearby, ready to assist at any hour. In some cases, a trusted bodyguard or valet would sleep at the foot of the bed, or even across the doorway, acting as a barrier between the sleeper and the world beyond. In royal palaces, courtiers might rise and dress the monarch each morning in a ritual known as the lever, or morning rising, which turned waking from sleep into a performance of power. Imagine now the French court of the 15th century, where King Charles VI, during his lucid moments, would be surrounded by attendants as he rose. His sleep was carefully monitored, his waking a moment of political ceremony. Yet Charles also suffered from mental illness, and during his episodes, his sleep was disturbed and erratic. One chronicler noted that he would go days without rest, or wake in terror, believing himself made of glass. In such examples, sleep and its disruption became a symbol of instability, not only for the person, but for the kingdom. Among the noble class, bedding was also an object of inheritance. In household inventories, a bed might be listed with the same gravity as land or livestock. A canopy of silk, a mattress stuffed with goose down, sheets imported from Flanders. These were costly items, passed down across generations, or gifted in marriage arrangements. In fact, a good bed was considered so valuable that it often traveled with its owner from estate to estate. The distinction between day and night also blurred in the elite households. Candles and oil lamps prolonged waking hours. Nobles often stayed up late, hosting feasts, playing games, or listening to minstrels. Sleep might begin later than for a peasant family, and yet it still often followed the segmented pattern familiar to the time. First, sleep, a period of wakefulness, and second, sleep. Even the elite were bound by nature's rhythm, though softened by luxury. There were, however, notable contrasts. Take, for example, the court of Isabella of Castile, a queen known for her piety and discipline. Despite her royal status, she often slept simply and rose early, favoring devotion over indulgence. Her court was one of order, where sleep habits mirrored religious ideals more than aristocratic comfort. Yet even in her austerity, the luxury of choice how to sleep, where, and with whom remained a privilege. In contrast, Richard III of England, whose reign was short and controversial, had more elaborate accommodations. Excavations of his living quarters, as well as accounts from the time, suggest richly decorated chambers and beds fit for a man conscious of image and authority. His bedchamber would have included not only sleeping space but a private area for prayer and study, a hearth for warmth, and possibly a garderobe or private toilet adjacent. Even in sleep, royalty was never truly alone. Records show that noble couples often had separate chambers, and while sleeping apart was not necessarily a sign of distance, it reflected the layered complexity of aristocratic life where political strategy, public appearance, and personal comfort all intertwined. Now turn your thoughts to the medieval guest. In a noble household, visitors of lower status might sleep in communal halls or antechambers, laid out on benches, pallets, or even straw-covered floors. The placement of a guest's bed, how close to the hearth, how far from the hosts, was a subtle expression of social rank. In contrast, in the homes of wealthy merchants or minor nobility, sleeping spaces were often multifunctional. A main room might serve as kitchen, workshop, and sleeping quarters, yet with finer materials and slightly more comfort than those of common villagers. These households were transitional, echoing both the intimacy of peasant life and the formality of courtly structures. And then, of course, there were inns and lodgings for travelers. In these spaces, shared sleeping was the norm. It was not uncommon to sleep beside strangers, bundled into long beds or lined up along benches, divided only by cloth curtains, if at all. The concept of sleeping alone, in silence and darkness, was largely a luxury of wealth. Even children's sleep reflected the social divide. Noble children might sleep in nurseries, attended by servants, while peasant children often curled beside parents or siblings, all sharing a bed or a mat near the fire. The closeness, while born of necessity, also fostered a familial bond. Sleep as a shared experience, a moment of warmth and security in a hard world. In all these examples, we see how sleep was not just rest, but representation. It told others who you were, how important, how wealthy, how devout, whether you slept alone or with a household, in a grand bedchamber, or by a fading fire, under furs, or beneath a thin wool blanket. Your sleeping life was shaped by the society around you. And as the medieval night unfolded, some in silent chambers behind heavy doors, others beneath simple roofs open to the cold and the stars, the rhythm of sleep persisted, unchanged by status, unmoved by politics. Just the slow return of the body to stillness, the quiet hum of breath, the retreat into dreams. As your mind settles into the quiet world we've wandered through together, let us allow one more segment of time to unfold. This will not be a tale of battles or great names, nor a list of dates or facts to memorize. Instead, think of it as a gentle drift through memory and meaning, a meditation on how sleep, that universal, silent companion, has shaped not just the past, but the rhythm of life itself. Let us return for a moment to that small medieval village, somewhere in the English countryside, perhaps or nestled in the foothills of the Alps. The sun has long set, and the air is cold. Smoke curls from chimneys, drifting upward into a deep and star-pocked sky. Within homes of timber and stone, the fires have been banked, their embers glowing faintly in the hearths. People lie close, wrapped in homespun wool, sharing warmth, breath, and the peace of night. What strikes us, when we compare their lives to ours, is how deeply intertwined their sleep was with the natural world. There were no alarms, no artificial lights to prolong the waking hours. The day ended when the sun sank behind the hills, and the night belonged to sleep not as interruption, but as restoration. The pattern of segmented sleep first and second sleep feels unfamiliar to us now, yet it was the rhythm of rest for centuries. Scholars believe that this habit emerged not from culture, but from biology. Left in the dark for long enough, even modern humans begin to fall into this rhythm. We sleep for 4 or 5 hours, wake for an hour or two, then sleep again until morning. This pause in the middle of the night was once seen as a natural, even sacred, space. Some used it to pray, others to make love. Some rose quietly, fed the fire, or wrote thoughts that had lingered through dreams. It was a quiet time, still dark, but not quite asleep, a place between worlds. Now imagine how this interlude might have felt. The fire low, casting long, soft shadows on the walls. The house still. Outside, the world blanketed in darkness and silence. Within, a sense of pause. Not restlessness, but a moment to exist quietly, to breathe, to think, to be. In that pause, there was space. Today, our nights are rarely so generous. With our devices and screens, glowing long after sunset, we push sleep to the edges. We compress it, delay it, try to conquer it. We scroll and type and stream, chasing distraction, delaying the moment we surrender. Sleep becomes an obligation, not a sanctuary. But in the Middle Ages, sleep was a rhythm to be kept, not beaten into submission. Across cultures and climates, it's also worth remembering that the habits of sleep varied greatly, not just across class lines, but also by region and climate. In the far north Scotland, Scandinavia, the Baltic winter nights were long, sometimes stretching for 14, 16, even 18 hours. In these places, it's likely that people experienced more than 2 phases of sleep, perhaps a nap in the afternoon, an early slumber after dusk, a waking hour around midnight, and then a return to sleep until the faint glow of morning. Sleep, in these regions, was a shifting, seasonal thing, ebb and flow, shaped by the sky. Contrast this with the sunnier regions of medieval Europe, southern Italy, Spain, parts of North Africa under Islamic rule. Here, sleep might be more fragmented in summer, interrupted by heat. In some cultures, it was customary to rest during the hottest part of the day, a practice not unlike the modern siesta. This created a different rhythm entirely. Wake early, nap at midday, stay active later into the evening. In these patterns, we see how adaptable the body is, how fluid our sleep can be when left to its own instincts, and how artificial our modern, rigid sleep schedules have become. Sacred sleep and dreams. In the medieval mind, sleep was never merely physical. It was also spiritual. It was a space where the soul could rise or fall. Dreams were rarely dismissed. To dream of a flood might suggest coming sorrow. To dream of bread might mean abundance. Priests, monks, and wise women all interpreted dreams with solemnity. Some dreams were seen as messages from saints or angels. Others were temptations from the devil. And still others were thought to be echoes of your own conscience, nudging you toward confession, repentance, or clarity. Manuscripts from the period included dream guides. Some were copied from earlier Roman texts, others created anew. People read them the way we might read horoscopes, searching for patterns, reassurance, warnings. In this view of the world, sleep was not idle. It was a liminal space, where the sacred and the profane could slip through, and so it was treated with respect. People said prayers before sleep, not merely as habit, but out of fear that they might not wake. In a world where death was closed through illness, childbirth, violence, each night carried risk. A prayer might be the last thing one said. "Now I lay me down to sleep." A phrase born centuries later captures the same sentiment that medieval people lived with. Sleep was a surrender, and surrender required faith. Sleeplessness, then and now. Even in the Middle Ages, not everyone slept easily. Records speak of the night wakefulness, of people tossing and turning, unable to rest, perhaps from hunger, from cold, from sorrow. or from the echo of guilt. But the response to sleeplessness was different. There were no pills, no glowing screens, no 24-hour distractions. If you could not sleep, you prayed, or rocked gently, or sat in silence, waiting for the body to soften again. In some texts, we find herbal remedies, infusions of valerian, chamomile, poppy, the leaves of linden trees. These were sipped slowly, by firelight, in the hopes of coaxing the body toward rest. Even now, science affirms what the old world already knew, that warmth, silence, and rhythm calm the mind. A fire crackling softly, a familiar voice reading aloud, the sound of distant rain on thatched roofs. It seems that the secrets of rest were never really secrets at all. They were practices, passed down not through books, but through habit, of clocks and curtains. The 14th and 15th centuries brought changes that would slowly begin to shift sleep patterns, subtly at first, then dramatically. The invention of the mechanical clock, once a marvel kept mostly in monasteries, began to spread to towns and churches. The clock tower began to ring. The hour began to matter. Life became less cyclical, more scheduled. In cities, street lamps emerged, flickering torches, lanterns, eventually gaslights. The darkness that had once brought on sleep was now held at bay. And with that, the night began to shrink. By the 18th and 19th centuries, segmented sleep began to fade from the written record. People slept in one long block, or tried to. The waking hour at midnight disappeared. The rhythm that had governed lives for centuries was lost to progress. Even our bedrooms changed. Thick curtains blocked out the moonlight. Walls separated children from parents. Mattresses swelled with springs and stuffing. And still, sleep drifted further away. The more control we tried to exert, the more elusive sleep became. It is no wonder that many now look backward, with a kind of longing not for the hardships of the medieval world, but for the gentler rhythm it offered. You have now walked with me through the nights of the Middle Ages. You have entered the smoky cottages of peasants, with their straw bedding and shared warmth. You have followed monks through stone corridors, rising at midnight to chant in the cold air. You have wandered into the mysteries of dreams, night visitors, and the strange beliefs that shaped medieval rest. And you have stepped quietly into noble chambers, where sleep was surrounded by curtains, servants, and ceremony. Each world was different. Each night unfolded in its own way. And yet, across them all, we see something familiar, the human need to close one's eyes, to surrender to rest, to drift into sleep. Let us linger here, in this thought. Sleep, in the Middle Ages, was not simply a private act. It was woven into community, into faith, into culture. Today, we often think of sleep as personal, a matter of individual routine. But for them, it was collective. Families huddled together. Monks rose together. Villagers listened for the watchman's call. Nobles shared their bedchambers with attendants. Sleep was always connected, always surrounded by others. And yet, within that closeness, each sleeper carried their own quiet journey into dreams, into silence, into the mysteries of the night. Imagine, if you will, one last scene. A medieval village, silent beneath the stars. The cottages are dark, the fires banked low. Through cracks in the shutters, a faint glow slips out, the last embers of the hearth fading to grey. Inside, a family lies together on their straw bed. Children shift and sigh. A dog curls at their feet. The parents drift in and out of first sleep. The sound of breathing fills the small room. Outside, the night stretches vast and still, the sky spangled with stars unspoiled by smoke or electric light. Now imagine another place, a monastery cloister. Stone walls echo faintly with the last chants of matins. The brothers return silently to their narrow beds. The candles are extinguished, the air cool and still. For a brief while, the cloister is hushed, waiting for the next bell. The rhythm of prayer and sleep continues, as it always has, steady as the turning of the seasons. And far away, in a castle chamber, a nobleman lies in a feather bed beneath embroidered coverlets. Servants rest nearby on pallets, half awake, half dozing, ready to rise if called. The heavy curtains are drawn, and within, the noble breathes slowly, steadily, surrounded by warmth, surrounded by power, yet vulnerable in sleep like any other. 3 places, 3 lives, and yet the same act, the same quiet surrender. It is comforting to remember how alike we are across the centuries. We may not share straw mattresses with family, or rise at midnight to chant psalms, or draw curtains around a featherbed, but still, we close our eyes. Still, we drift into silence. Still, we dream. What has changed, perhaps, is the night itself. For medieval people, the dark was truly dark. The stars were brighter, the shadows deeper, the silence more complete. For us, the night is never quite so still. Lights glow, machines hum, the outside world remains awake. Yet the rhythm of the body, the need for rest, is unchanged. Think of your own bed now. Soft, steady, familiar. Perhaps a pillow beneath your head, smooth sheets beneath your body, blankets wrapped around you. You are warmer, more comfortable, more secure than almost anyone in the Middle Ages could have imagined. No lice or fleas in the straw. No drafts creeping through wooden shutters. No fear of night visitors pressing down upon your chest. You are safe. You are sheltered. You are at rest. The contrast is striking, and yet, it is not meant to disturb you. Rather, it is a reminder of gratitude. A reminder that in this moment, you have what so many before you longed for: quiet, comfort, peace. The centuries between their nights and ours melt away, leaving only this simple truth: sleep is a gift. And as we reflect, we notice something else. In their segmented nights, with first sleep and second sleep, medieval people accepted that wakefulness was natural. They did not fight against it. If they stirred in the middle of the night, they prayed, they whispered, they tended the fire. They embraced the pause. Perhaps there is a lesson there for us. If you wake in the night, restless or uncertain, remember, it is not unusual. It is not new. For centuries, people rose in the darkness, lived a little in the still hours, and returned again to sleep. You, too, may drift in and out. You, too, may surrender to the rhythm of rest, without forcing it, without worry. The night is long enough. There is time enough. Now, let us walk slowly back through the images we have seen tonight. The cottage, smelling faintly of straw and smoke. The monastery cloister, cold stone beneath bare feet. The noble chamber, with curtains heavy and embroidered. The dream books, whispering of signs and symbols. The box beds, enclosed like wooden cupboards. The watchman's voice in the village street, calling that all is well. These pictures float gently in the mind, like embers drifting from a fading fire. They are fragments, but together they form a tapestry, the tapestry of medieval nights. And now, you may let those pictures fade further. They do not demand your attention. They do not insist on staying sharp. They may blur, soften, drift, just as your own thoughts begin to wander. Because the purpose of this journey is not only to learn about the past, it is to rest in it, to feel the slow rhythm of their lives, to absorb the calm, and to allow yourself to follow them into sleep. Imagine the weight of the wool blanket across your body, the faint scent of lavender in the straw, the hush of silence outside the cottage walls. Imagine the cool air of the monastery cell, or the warmth of the featherbed, whichever you prefer. These are not your nights, but they may soothe your own. Breath by breath, let the images of medieval sleep merge with your own. Breath by breath, let the centuries fall away. Breath by breath, let your body grow heavy, safe, and still. In the Middle Ages, sleep was precious. It was a daily gift, uncertain, never fully guaranteed. For you, too, it is a gift, and one you may accept now, without effort, without thought. The night is long enough. There is time enough. Your eyes may close. Your body may rest. The world will wait until morning. And so, as we close this journey, remember, peasants, monks, nobles, all of them lay down at night, as you do now. All of them breathed, dreamed, and surrendered to the same mystery. And just as they woke to another day, so too will you. For now, though, there is nothing more to do. Only the quiet. Only the dark. Only sleep. Good night.